Hi guys, thank you so much for coming. So this is a Stripes event, and if you don't know about Stripes, we are a small student group which provides support, pastoral care and community to LGBT plus students and allies. We're an entirely non-exclusive club and we're all very happy to have you guys here today. I would like to note Chris Puplick for coming and supporting us, former President of the Anti-Discrimination Board. Thank you very much. And it's such an honour for me to be able to introduce Michael Kirby, the Honourable Michael Kirby, here today to speak to us. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Claire, and thank you all for being here. I acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, and I pay my respects to them and to all Indigenous people. We must remember that a lot of the problems and injustices that have been suffered by the Aboriginal and Indigenous people of Australia have been suffered because of the state of the law, LAW, and we therefore have to assume obligations to correct that situation. And it's an interesting point that although we are one of the longest serving democratic societies in the whole world, continuously in operation, back to the first decades of the 19th century, the removal of one of the greatest barriers that the Indigenous people suffered, namely the failure of the Australian legal system to recognise their land rights, was not corrected by an Australian Parliament. It was corrected by a court, the High Court of Australia, on which I had the honour to serve. And one of the greatest decisions in the history of the High Court was, of course, the Mabo decision, Mabo against Queensland, number 2, 1992, 175 Commonwealth law reports at 1. And that was the leading judgment in that case was written by my friend and colleague in the Law Reform Commission, the Honourable Sir Gerard Brennan, who is a most notable Australian Catholic and a wonderful lawyer and judge. Now, I also want to acknowledge Notre Dame Australia University. I have been to the campus on a number of occasions, but this is the first time that I've had the opportunity to speak to a class, or at least to a group of students who have come to hear what I have to say. I'm glad that this has been arranged. It has taken a little time to organise it, but it has been arranged, and that is an appropriate thing in a university that is within the Australian universities system. I said that I would come here today to talk about issues relevant to Stripes and relevant to the issue of LGBTIQ human rights. But that's an enormous subject, and it extends over a huge territory, and we don't have the time to do that because I want to talk for about half an hour and then to have Q&A after that, where you can ask me about the subject of my talk, or if you're having any particular problems with any little legal question, you can ask me about that. If you've got an essay that is outstanding and you're having a mental blank, well, you can ask me about that and I'll see if I can help. But I said that I thought it would be more appropriate and relevant, given that I'm here at Notre Dame Australia University, for me to tell you about the visit that I made recently to the Vatican for the purpose of seeing Pope Francis and what happened on that visit. The International Bar Association is the biggest association of judges and lawyers in the world. It's based in London, and in 2011 the council of the IBA decided to adopt a resolution calling on all countries of all members of the IBA to get rid of the criminal laws that still exist in many of those countries against LGBTIQ people, lesbians, gays, bisexual, transgender, intersex and otherwise queer people. A person of my age has a problem with that word queer because it is an insulting word in my life to call somebody queer. But as in the endeavour to secure full human rights for women and for people of different races, sometimes those who are the subject of a disrespect for their human rights used words which are insulting in order that they can take them over and remove the insult. And so it's LGBTIQ people who suffer human rights deprivations, and it was in order to follow up that resolution of 2011 that the IBA, through its present president, Horatio Netes, decided that it would seek an audience with Pope Francis. And for that purpose, it sought assistance from the LGBTIQ forum within the IBA, and one of the most active members of that forum is Dr. Leonardo Radnovich, who is from Argentina. And of course Pope Francis, before his elevation to the see of St. Peter, was from Argentina. He was Archbishop of Buenos Aires. And so steps were taken through Leonardo to see if His Holiness would be interested to meet a mission from the IBA. And the message came back that His Holiness would be pleased to grant a private audience with the mission of the IBA. That didn't come as a big surprise to us, because I'm sure everyone here, especially if they are LGBTIQ identifying or LGBTIQ interested and supportive, would know what a big difference has happened since the election of Pope Francis to be the Supreme Pontiff of the Catholic Church. That has led to quite a different tone in the statements that have been made. It's probably fair to say that most of the differences have emerged in oral statements made by the Pope rather than in written rescripts in which he's laid down new principles or new ideas. But the tone has changed very radically from the tone of papal statements and other statements during the reign of Pope John Paul II and Pope Benedict XVI. Even when he came back after his election to Argentina, Pope Francis gathered together his modest possessions and then went back to the airport to fly back to Rome. And you'll remember that, as happens nowadays with important people on planes, I mean, all that you and I have to do is settle back and hope that we'll get a drink of water or something very soon. But if you're important, you have a press conference on the plane. And Pope Francis did that, and of course one of the media asked him what was his view on LGBTIQ issues. And Pope Francis answered saying, if a person is of good faith and is seeking God, and if they are sincere in that search, who am I to judge them just because they're LGBTIQ? Now, such a statement would not be particularly remarkable in the world today, because so much has happened in the last half century in particular in understanding of the science of sexual orientation and gender identity. It wouldn't be remarkable, but coming from the mouth of the man who had just been elected to be the Supreme Pontiff, it was a remarkable statement, because the answer one could come back with would be, well, Your Holiness, if anyone is to judge, it will be you. But he said, who am I to judge? My upbringing was in the simple faith of the Anglican Church. I was not brought up as a Roman Catholic, but I've been told by those who know the ins and outs of the Catholic tradition that what the Pope then did was very typical of those in the Jesuit order. They always answer a question with a question of their own. And so his question, which he came back with, was, who am I to judge? And it therefore sought an answer back by the faithful, by people who respected him because of his office and because of his previous service and because of the service that they were looking to from him in the future. Since then, there have been a number of steps that have been taken by Pope Francis which have shown an outreach to LGBTIQ people. This is quite different from the outreach or lack of outreach of his predecessors. His predecessor, Pope Benedict, had declared that LGBTIQ people were suffering from an inherent disorder and essentially suggesting that there was something medically or psychically or emotionally wrong. That is not the view that is now taken by science, and the World Health Organization and other organs of the United Nations have removed sexuality and sexual orientation from the DSM, which is a diagnostic tool that's used by the medical profession throughout the world, and it is now not regarded by the medical professions that it is either a physical or mental illness if you are LGBTIQ, and therefore the Pope was merely, in a sense, catching up with the science that had developed in the last 70 years. But there was more. When he went to the United States of America, he was asked by a friend who had been his friend in Argentina if he, the friend, could meet him when he was in New York, when he was in Washington. And the Pope immediately agreed, because they had been friends in Argentina, and he asked could he bring along his partner. His partner was a same-sex partner. Now, I don't think that is something that Pope Benedict would have welcomed, but Pope Francis is his own man, and he said, of course. And so his friend brought along his partner, and they greeted each other as long-lost friends, and they were another symbol of the changing times of this pontificate. Since then, Pope Francis has done many things. One of them was in Chile. He went to Chile because you may know that there were a number of complaints there about the hierarchy of the church, and I think the Pope called for, and he certainly received, letters of resignation from most, if not all, of the higher holders of office in the church in Chile. And he was approached in Chile by a young man who had been allegedly molested by one of the holders of these offices. And this young man greeted the Pope and was greeted by him, and the Pope had made a request that he should be in the audience to be greeted by him. He had been a young person who was himself identifying as gay, and he had asked if he would be welcome to come to the Pope's audience in Chile, and he was told, of course you will be, and he was invited to the audience, and he then said to the Pope in words that were recorded and later published in the world media how he felt unworthy, and he felt it very difficult to speak, and when he was indicating that it was his intention to speak of what he had been through, he was told, don't do that because you are gay, and if you do that you will be denounced and it will be a ruination of your life because you will be exposed as a gay man who is making this complaint. And notwithstanding that, this young man went ahead with his complaint. And so he told Pope Francis that he felt that he was alienated from the church, and Pope Francis said to him, you must not think ill of yourself. You must love yourself. You must love the church. The Pope loves you, and you must love yourself. And that was the message the Pope was passing on to this young man who had previously been alienated from the church in Chile. So we have here, by all accounts, by the reports of the statements of Pope Francis, a person who is in a sense a modern person, and a person who is caught up a little belatedly with the science on this subject, and who is anxious, of course, to fulfill his duties as the Pope, but is also anxious to turn a page in the relationship with LGBTIQ people. It hasn't been a complete turning of the page, and it hasn't led to steps being taken by the Pope in writing to declare that things are changing or things have changed. But when we received the word from Leonardo that the Pope would welcome a mission from the IBA then began to get together a very senior group of people to go to Rome, because it is, of course, a very great honour to be received in audience by the Pope, and for a gay person like myself, a special honour and privilege to be received in private audience by Pope Francis. And so the meeting was arranged, a day was appointed, we were told the Pope would be present. We then organised our meeting. Horacio Neves from Brazil, the president of the IBA, was to lead the delegation, It was also to include Baroness Helena Kennedy, who is not LGBTIQ. She's a Baroness of the United Kingdom, a QC, a top human rights lawyer, and she was the principal of Mansfield College at Oxford University, but she stood down from that and became the head of the Secretariat of the Human Rights Institute of the IBA. So she's a very accomplished person, and she was going to come, Leonardo was going to come, and they decided that they wanted to have somebody who was identifying as LGBT, because Horatio does not, Leonardo does, but he's not in the leadership of the IBA, and Helena does not, and so they asked me to come. Now, it's an awful long way to go. We Australians know what international, intercontinental travel is. Americans think if they go 4 hours in a plane, this is mind-boggling and life-changing. But we know we face at least 24 hours and probably about 30 in all to get from anywhere in Australia to anywhere else. But I thought it was important that there be somebody who identifies, who could speak directly to the Pope about what it is like growing up as a gay person, stigmatised by criminal law, and what that does to your psyche when that's happening. We've got rid of those laws in Australia, but criminal laws still exist in about 80 countries of the world, and many of those countries are English-speaking countries of the Commonwealth of Nations. Many others are Islamic countries, but it's quite a lot of countries. And so the team was assembled, we were all ready, the tickets were issued. I was sitting in my office, my chambers in Sydney, and I got a phone call telling me that Pope Francis had withdrawn from the private audience. I was about to leave for the airport. It was the very morning when I was due to go to the airport, that he had withdrawn because he'd found a diary clash. That sounded like diplomatic language for that he had decided that because of the internal disagreements, which are understandable in the light of the history of the churches generally, including my own church, the Anglican Church, that he had decided that it would not be timely to meet a delegation on this issue. And because it was all lined up, he indicated, the Pope, that he was nominating the Cardinal Secretary of State of the Holy See to receive the mission on his behalf, and that he, the Cardinal Secretary of State, would report to the Pope personally on the mission. I then did two things. I rang the executive director of the IBA in London, it was night there, to see if he was still going. And he said, the President has indicated that he's cancelling his ticket. The President has said he would go to meet the Pope, but he was not going to meet a functionary of the Pope. And so the President of the IBA was not coming. I then rang my partner, now my spouse, to ask him what he thought I should do, because he is a very wise person and he's not a lawyer, he's not filled with lawyerly concerns. He looks on things as a wise, normal human being. And he said, you must speak truth to power. It is your duty. You should go and you should tell the Pope through the Cardinal Secretary of State what it was like in your life, because what it was like in your life is still going on in so many countries, and probably worse than it ever was in Australia. In Australia, if you kept very, very quiet and never told anybody and kept it very silent, and if you were basically ashamed of yourself and ashamed of your position, then you would be let alone. But in some countries, there's a lot of violence and death, and therefore Johan said, you must go. So I was all packed, ready to go. I had my ticket. I went out to Sydney Airport by the airport train, and I got on the plane and I went straight through to Rome. And when I got to Rome, I had to get a taxi, and the taxi driver drove like a maniac through the streets of Rome. It was very late in the evening, and I was very tired after the long trip, as we tend to be. And then I opened my eyes and I saw those wonderful columns of Bellini's magnificent creation of St. Peter's in Rome. And I knew that I had arrived at the Vatican, and I was taken to a hotel which is built into the column area, and it's a hotel named after Pope Paul VI. So I went. I was very late, and fortunately they were still on duty, and so they showed me into a very humble, small room where I spent the night, and then at 9 o'clock in the morning the mission of the IBA met in a larger and more ornate hotel. I think that was probably the hotel intended for the president of the IBA, but not for underlings like me, who was coming there to speak of it from my point of view. We met, we discussed what would happen. It was agreed that Helena Kennedy, who after all is a QC, should speak first, that Leonardo should speak second, and that I should speak third. And so we went into St. Peter's Square. We saw the milling crowds, as I had seen on previous visits to that historic place. And I was then led up a grand staircase, which was the diplomatic staircase where the ambassadors to the Holy See come. Everything is enormous and on a super scale, but then we were led down, and then we were led up, and then we were led down, and we ended up in what appeared to be the catacombs of Rome. It was an underground room. It seemed to be entirely built of rocks and stones, and in the room was a bench rather like the bench that is behind me. Now, I may not know too much about the Vatican, but I do know about benches, and I know that they are created for the purpose of symbolising the relationship between he who is on the bench and they who are below the bench. And so the bench was there, and we all waited. And then suddenly there was a stirring, and the Cardinal Secretary of State entered the room. He was wearing a red scarlet cap, and he went up on the bench, and of course he sat in the middle. On his right was a woman whom I have met before in AIDS meetings in Geneva, and suffice it to say that she was not very friendly to the issues that were being put before her on the last occasion, but she said not a word during this audience. On the left was a young American religious who was there I think, to help, because the whole proceeding was conducted in English, and the Cardinal Secretary of State is Pietro Cardinal Parolin. He is an Italian cardinal and a very senior one in the hierarchy of the Vatican. And so Helena Kennedy got up and she talked about the fact that the laws are not required in her submission by the Catechism or principles of the Catholic Church. She declared herself to be a Catholic, and she said what a great honour and privilege it was to be there. And then she finished. Leonardo then talked about developments in Latin America, because that was what he was intending to speak to the Pope about. And in Latin America, because they didn't, except for Guyana and the islands of the Caribbean, they do not have criminal laws against gays. This was a sweet little gift that the British gave to all of their colonies, but it wasn't something that the Spanish had in their criminal codes or that the French had in their criminal codes. They'd got rid of it centuries ago. And he explained all that, and he explained what had happened in Argentina, where the previous criminal offence was removed in about the year 1802. And so that was his, and he declared that he was a Catholic and he had been brought up. So I thought the first thing I should declare when I started was that I was not a Catholic and that I was an Anglican. And that was the only time I saw Cardinal Parolin smile. He found it interesting that this speaker was not of that tradition. But I pointed out that the traditions of all the Christian churches have, because of biblical texts, the understanding of biblical texts, not been very friendly to LGBTIQ people, though there are many theologians who say they are not necessary interpretations of the biblical texts any more than the interpretations of the Second Amendment to the United States Constitution is a necessary or even compelling interpretation to allow Americans to go around with huge numbers of guns and Kalashnikovs, and that is not a necessary interpretation, but sometimes it takes a while for the necessary interpretation to be seen. I told the Cardinal Secretary of State of my own life growing up in Sydney. I told him of my minister in the Anglican Church at Strathfield. His name was the Reverend Cecil Dillon. He'd been a padre in the Second World War, and he never talked about Christian beliefs concerning sex or bedrooms or anything of that. He talked about the Nazis and the oppression of so many people, and he invited along, actually, Pastor Niemöller, who was a friend of Bonhoeffer, who was a great Protestant theologian who stood up against Hitler and was executed. But Niemöller survived. But he came to our little parish church on the corner of Concord Road and Parramatta Road and spoke to us about courage and about the necessity of courage. So I finished. I told him that there were too many tears on too many pillows of young people, and the Pope had the power to stop that, and we hoped that he would stop it, because it isn't necessary and it's missing the main point of the Christian belief, which is a religion of love and reconciliation. So the Cardinal Archbishop at the end of the of the session said he believed that there was a lot of common ground between what had been said and the positions being advanced by the IBA Human Rights Institute. He said that the central teaching of the Church on fundamental human rights was human dignity, that it's all based ultimately in a respect for each other's dignity as a human being, and that that would guide the Holy See in its approach to our mission. It's interesting that if you look at the first article of the the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, it refers to human dignity, and it is certainly very important in Roman Catholic theological writings. And he picked that up and said, this is something we will have to consider. And so we all got up. The Swiss guards escorted us up to the grand staircase. Up we went, and down we went, and up we went, and eventually back into the milling crowds outside. I had told Cardinal Parolin that back in, I think it was 1962 or 3, I was blessed by Pope John the 23rd, whom I described as another great reforming pope. I was in St. Peter's Square as a student from Sydney University on my way to Nigeria, of a student delegation at that time when I was the age of most of you in this room. And the whole of the square knelt on their knees and were blessed by the Pope. As a Protestant, I didn't kneel on my knees. I think I was the only one who was standing, but I bowed my head because John the 23rd was undoubtedly a most charismatic and important leader, and as you know, he established the Second Vatican Council, which began the process of reforms within the Catholic Church. And I told Cardinal Parolin that undoubtedly there would be in that crowd of milling youngsters in the square young gay people, and they are children of the Church, and they have to be respected and protected by the Church. And so we went away and we had a debrief, as you do. We went into the expensive hotel, which was set aside for our absent friend, the president of the IBA. We talked about it. We were reasonably pleased with the way the audience had gone. But of course, the proof of the pudding is always in the eating, and there is always a desire to see success, and sometimes it's elusive. Since that meeting, which was at the end of April, we have seen a statement issued by the Congregation on Catholic Education, which is titled "Male and Female, He Created Them." And without wishing to summarise that, it's mainly about trans people, and it is not very friendly to the position of trans people. But it doesn't say much about LGB people, and so as far as we are concerned in the IBA, the dialogue is continuing, and I hope that with the Pope's intervention it will be a fruitful and successful dialogue, and that was the objective of going there. So that is what I came to tell you about. It's certainly a very interesting thing to go into the very centre of the Catholic Church and see the way it's organised, and see the milling crowds of people who look to it for leadership and for love and protection. And I think it was a good thing that we had the mission. I think it was a wise thing that I went and took part in it. I went with a full heart and with respect, and seeking to find a pathway to improve the situation, because if the Pope could take an initiative and felt that he was able to do that, there's no doubt that would help the politicians in many of the countries who are not taking steps to remove the criminal laws but are keeping them in place to the punishment and harassment of people, especially young people in those countries, particularly in the Caribbean, but also in Africa and in some countries of Asia. And it's therefore something which needs to change, not only for the basic human dignity and human rights of the people affected, but also for the struggle against HIV and AIDS, because a lot of statistical and other information collected by UNAIDS and the World Health Organization have shown that in those countries which still have the criminal laws, the number of people who will go forward and get the test and get onto the antiretrovirals and remove the spread of the virus and protect themselves and save their lives, that's much lower than in the countries where there is no impediment of that kind. If you divide the French and Spanish colonies, former colonies in the Caribbean, and the British former colonies, and then you look at the levels of HIV, it's about twice as high in the British countries as it is in the Spanish and French colonies, where they don't have laws against gays. No, they don't have criminal laws. They, of course, have social and cultural attitudes, but they don't have criminal laws to lock people up because of their sexuality. And that was the distinction we were drawing, and just asking the Pope to say that that is not necessary, and we hope that that is what he will come round to saying. So, thank you for having me here to talk about this. It's not immediately relevant to us in Australia because we have removed those criminal laws. But criminal laws are only a part of the jigsaw, and other parts of it include attitudes and parental attitudes, the difficulty young people have in talking to their parents and to their siblings, which is certainly something that I felt in my early life. And kindness and love really requires that we get rid of these things, which in legal terms are an overreach of the criminal law into private conduct, which is not suitable for legal regulation. Okay, that's it. We'll have a big round of applause and then a few questions. Now, I went on a bit too long, I fear.
Do you want to do... Sorry, what time is it? So,
do any of those poor unfortunates who are outside there are empty seats on the front? This is like church. It's empty in the front rows.
So did you want to do a few questions?
Yes, I think so. This is a democracy, and you don't have to agree with a single word that I've said. You're entitled to have your own different position. But are there any questions or comments? Yes.
More of a general question. What would you say is the case that you've presided over that has had the most of a lasting impact on you?
Well, I think maybe the one that's had the most lasting impact was Wick, because Wick came to the High Court quite soon after I was appointed in 1996. And as you know, Mabo had been decided in 1992, and Mabo decided that Aboriginal people were entitled to their traditional lands in areas of Crown land that were not otherwise attributed. And the question in Wick was, does the issue of a certificate as a pastoral lease make the Mabo principle inapplicable to the position of Aboriginals on pastoral leases? And if you look at a map of Australia where there are pastoral leases, it is a huge part of Australia. I think it's about 40% of Australia. And we have a continental-sized country, and so it's a tremendous area. And if I can put it bluntly, there are minerals in them thar hills. And many people, many Australians have been really surprised that the poor Aboriginal people are so poor, and they have such poor housing, and they have such poor schooling, and they have such poor health care. But it all goes back to the deprivation of the means of their economic betterment and improvement. And therefore, when we make our little statements in meetings such as this, honouring and paying respects to the traditional elders, and when we talk about a symbolic statement in our constitution, my own view is it would be a whole lot better if we started thinking about money, because until we deal with righting those wrongs and problems, we're going to continue to have people in this country who are the first people and yet are very seriously disadvantaged. So does that change the situation? Well, a bit, and it certainly was very important symbolically. But you know, I often get asked by students, what is the most important decision you think you've ever decided, or what is the one you're proudest of, they ask me. Well, to be honest, I'm proud of all of them. I'm proud of those where I was in a majority. I'm proud of those where I was in dissent. I really gave it my best effort, and I took every case seriously. And I had a wonderful colleague in the Court of Appeal, Justice Roddy Marr, and he would tend to fall asleep after lunch, which was a difficult and awkward position for me because I was usually presiding. But I've had all sorts of techniques, and I'd ask him a question, I'd push a book in his direction, but my problem was not falling asleep. My problem was hyperactivity. I had a Barocca every day in the morning. The court reporting said we knew Justice Kirby was sitting because we could hear the fizz of the Barocca going over. And I was very deeply engaged. And I used to tell judicial visitors from other countries, the best thing I can tell you about this place is I never got a phone call from a minister telling me how to decide a case or asking me, saying this would be helpful to the government if you decided, if you found it possible to decide. Nothing like that ever happened. I never got a brown paper envelope with money in it, such as allegedly did happen in Joe Bjelke-Petersen's Queensland. I never was at a conference and a wink wink, nudge nudge. Nothing like that ever happened. The judges in Australia, you may disagree with them, and I disagree with them sometimes, but they are independent, including independent of each other. And that's something that your generation of lawyers has to preserve, because it isn't true in most countries of the world. Any other questions? Yes.
You've briefly mentioned societies with systemic bigotry that's regularly enforced, such as the Caribbean and some Arab Emirates countries. My question is, why do you think reform for, not necessarily theocracies, but countries that do have that enforced bigotry, why do you think it's so hard to reform? Do you think it's because it's effective, the power of faith? Or?
Well, I think that it's hard to reform because of many factors, cultural, traditional, but also religious. And I don't think it's as hard in Christian countries. I think it's very hard in Islamic countries, because the Prophet was not only a religious mystic and leader, he was a general and a politician. And the Hadith has very detailed rules, and even extending to how gay people are to be killed. which is by throwing them off a tower. Nowadays that has been changed to throwing them off a tall building. So it's very detailed. You know that Jesus never said anything at all directly about homosexuals, but there are statements in the Old Testament which have been interpreted to mean animosity, and there's statements in one of St. Paul's letters to the Corinthians even about the issue, which in modern translations has been translated as drunks, adulterers, ... You've heard this, haven't you? And homosexuals. Well, that word wasn't invented in the English language until the 1850s, so it wasn't in the original Hebrew or Aramaic. And so why is it difficult? Well, it's difficult because a lot of religious people are like not a few lawyers and judges I have met. They will give meaning to words without looking at the context. My partner is not religious at all, but I've clung on to my religion, and I don't want anyone taking it away from me. If you do that, you know that the context, especially of the Christian religion, is really a wonderful thing. And therefore it's very unlikely that there would be in specific words something which condemned a whole group of people for a reason they do not choose and cannot change, to be outside the love of God. And therefore that is the problem. And we just need people to see words in context. That's at least my opinion. I'm not a theologian, of course, but I've spent an awful lot of my life interpreting language, and I know how important context. I wrote a brilliant article in the Melbourne Law Review. It's called Text, Context, Purpose. These three, but the greatest of these is text. That's a reference to one of the passages in St. Paul's letter to the Corinthians where he says faith, hope and love. The King James Version says charity. Faith, hope and love, these three, but the greatest of these is love. And so if you want to see a view of this in the legal context, just have a look at that article, because it is actually a very good summation of how judges go about interpreting words. Context is very important. Any other questions? Yes. I think I'd better give you a chance.
What would your advice be to young LGBTQ people who are oppressed or rejected by the church or the community?
Well, I don't know so much about the Catholic Church, though I suspect it's much the same. In the Anglican Church, there's always, because the Anglican Church was a compromise. It was a compromise between the old church, which was the Catholic wing, and the new church, which was the Protestant wing. And so they've always had to somehow accommodate within the one church two quite distinctive wings. Now, in my own case, I grew up in Sydney at St Andrews, Strathfield, in a very Protestant church. The tradition of the Sydney diocese is very Protestant. If you go into a Sydney diocese church, you will see no cross with the Saviour on it. It's always the risen Lord. It's an empty cross. And you'll have no bells and smells. They don't have incense. And to be truthful, as that was what I was brought up in, that's what I'm comfortable with. And I like the simplicity because I do think Jesus was a revolutionary, and therefore it's sort of not grand, it's, except on royal occasions, it's sort of basically very simple. So how can you accommodate it? In the Anglican Church, you just go to a church where there is accommodation. St James Anglican Church in Sydney has on its brochure as you go in, we are a church that is open to people of every race and so on, and every sexuality. They sort of, it's up front. And I'm sure that's so in the Catholic Church too. I'm absolutely sure there would be particular parishes and particular priests and so on who would be welcoming. And it's just going to take a bit of time to change the dimensions and the dynamics, but it will come. Whenever there's been a clash between science and religion, religion has ultimately accommodated. I was reading this morning something Cardinal Pell said about Adam. He was asked, was there a physical person, Adam and Eve? Did they exist? And he said, this is actually a very sophisticated parable, and it's not a statement of what happened in bodily form. But of course there would have been many people in the last century, and especially the century before, who would, believing in absolute creationism, would have said, well, there was one Adam and there was one Eve, but he said it's a parable, and he said it's a very sophisticated parable. So my answer is, you just find there is in the Catholic Church an organisation called Dignity, I think, and I don't want to be giving any advice on this, but young people can get onto the web and can look it all up, and no doubt already have. But I think there is a lot of hope in Pope Francis, and I would say not only as a leader of the Catholic Church, but as a leader of the Christian churches. But there are two problems, and they include the problem of the conservatives within every church, and the leadership that will give a blessing to going ahead. So at the moment we're all relying very much on the blessing that Pope Francis has given to an open dialogue. He asked a question and we are now answering his question. Who am I to judge? Well, we're offering answers to that. Any other questions? Yes.
How would you say your faith and sexuality has affected your life through your legal career?
Well, I think my sexuality made me questioning of discrimination. If you've suffered discrimination, you don't like it. And therefore, I'm against discrimination against Catholics. I'm against discrimination against women. I'm against discrimination against Muslims. I'm against discrimination on any basis that is not fully justified by the circumstances of the case. The first article of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is a great document which I got from my teacher, Mr. Gorringe, at the Summerhill Opportunity School in 1949, soon after it was adopted, is all persons are free and equal in dignity and rights. And I think this is a wonderful statement, in dignity and rights. Interesting that dignity is placed before rights. And that is really basically in line with the fundamental way the Roman Catholic Church approaches it, which places great emphasis upon human dignity. So, did it affect me? Did my church affect me? Not, I hope, to to be prejudiced for church things when they came before the courts, but of course the central message of love in Christianity can only really change you for the better and make you more understanding of the need of law to adapt when it can. Sometimes it can't. And I sat in cases where the law was clear and constitutional and not challenged for its constitutionality, and I had to give effect to the law. You're not doing palm tree justice, you're applying the law. But often there's ambiguity and uncertainty, and then your duty is to explain why you take a different view. So that's what I did. It's up to you, the readers of the decisions, to decide what you think. I think future generations are going to be very critical about us for the way we have treated asylum seekers.
Thank you for that. I just have a little question. You've already touched on it a little bit and talked about the importance of words and other cultures. I wonder what your perspective is on, I suppose, Eastern. Can you hear me now? I wonder what your perspective is on.
Yeah. That's okay.
I'm so sorry. Can you hear me?
Well, you asked the question, and maybe you can come and tell me what the question was.
Maybe you can just get up.
I'm so sorry. I wonder what your perspective is on Eastern religions and cultures and their view of LGBTIQ community, because even though, say, India just passed legislation, quite frankly, they don't really understand words and the importance of law. It's a matter of, I don't know.
Yeah, well, the question is, what do you do when you get a clash between clear religion and LGBT status? Well, that's when we really have to rely a lot on the international community. And it's very interesting that the Human Rights Council, of which Australia is a member for the first time at the moment, established about 7 years ago the Office of the Independent Expert on Sexual Orientation and Gender Identity. And that was challenged by countries that opposed it. And it challenged in the Human Rights Council, in the Third Committee of the General Assembly, in the Fifth Committee of the General Assembly, and then on the floor of the plenary of the General Assembly. And the final vote, it just got through by a whisker. But it was challenged the other day when they renewed the mandate of the independent expert. But the vote was much more affirmative to the continuance of the mandate. And that seems to indicate that the world has its fights about these things, but ultimately the world moves on and doesn't seek to reopen the wound. So I think we just have to hope that we can spread the knowledge of science, because the science on human sexuality is at least 70 years old and probably more. And in fact, one of the early scientists in the field was Alfred Kinsey, who was a professor. He was actually a zoologist, and his great expertise was gall wasps, which are a form of bee. And so he had millions of examples of gall wasps. He studied these gall wasps, and then suddenly he changed and started to study human beings and their sexual lives. And that's been built on greatly by people who come later, Evelyn Hooker and others. And it does reveal, and has been accepted by the medical and other psychiatric and other professions, that a certain percentage of people are lifelong lesbian or gay or bisexual, and also there is a proportion who are trans or intersex. So these are just variations in nature. They do exist in other species. They raise a question: if it hasn't been bred out of nature, why has nature put it there? And in my little brain, I've tried to work that out, and I've thought maybe it is put there so that I, who am released from the obligations of the nuclear family, have a responsibility and engagement with a larger family of community generally. Studies of geese show that there are gay geese, and they tend to be those who look after the flock rather than after their own children. Well, not children, but you know what I mean, gooselings or whatever the word is. So if it's in nature and if it persists, it's there for a purpose. Nature doesn't do things without a purpose. Yes, you have a question.
My question is more in relation to your formative years in leaving law school and then moving in through the industry, making your way to the High Court. You'd like to make some commentary on that and the different experiences you had, because especially a lot of law students now find it into a very competitive market in terms of competing for different positions, and yeah, what you can say about that, you know. Yeah.
Well, I was very fortunate in my life. I've had a dream run, really, if you analyse it. But I think, you remember that film Dead Poets Society? And I was Chancellor at Macquarie University, and I gave an honorary degree to Peter Weir, because Peter Weir had failed at Sydney University and he never got a degree. So I wanted to give him a degree. And I saw that movie and I thought it was so moving, where he was confronted by a problem and people got up on the desk and said the poem. Your teachers, next to your parents and your siblings, maybe your grandmother, the most important people you meet. And I found that wonderful, that was, he was saying, you've got to seize the day, carpe diem. And I think that is the big lesson from that movie, and it's a big lesson of my life. You often can't manufacture the chances, but you've got to be ready for them. And when they come, you've got to seize them, and you've got to do what you can to be worthy of them and to make the most of them and to work your guts out to earn it and to prevail. When I was appointed President of the Court of Appeal, I was a very young person when I was appointed, and there were no doubt people who thought they should have been appointed over me, and I understood that. But my solution to that was I would get in earlier and earlier. I would read everything about the case. I would be on top of the case. No one would ever be able to show that I had not absorbed something essential to the case. And I still get into my office. I was there this morning at 5 a.m. The tradition of the New South Wales Bar is to start very early in the day, because your mind is fresh, you've got energy, you're ready to face anything, and you can get a lot of stuff into your brain quickly. And so that's how I did it. I just worked doubly hard. And it's easy if you agree with your colleagues in a multi-member court. Life is easy. You just send around a little note, I agree with Justice, let it be Justice Gummo. But if you don't agree, then you've got to explain why. You may agree with their outcome but not with their reasons, or you may disagree with their outcome and their reasons. And then you have to explain it, and that means you've got to work. But the good thing, the British gave the world the sodomy offence, which is a big problem in many countries, and the politicians won't touch it because the churches defend it, but they also gave independent judges and a legal system that on the whole we can be proud of, and they gave the independence of the judges with the obligation to express their own personal opinion in a case and not to be overborne. This is not Tammany Hall. The High Court of Australia is not, you don't do a deal, well, I'll agree with you on this one if you agree with me next week. Doesn't happen. And that's a wonderful thing, really. It means you may disagree with the judge, but you are getting the real product of their thinking.
All right, we might have to stop it there because I know a lot of us have class, but we wanted to thank you so much, and we, Stripes Committee has made a gift for you.
We just wanted to say thank you so much. Oh gosh, sorry. On behalf of everyone here, thank you so much for coming and talking to us on such an important topic.
Oh, Captain, my captain, what an inspiration.
Yeah, and that's a wonderful passage.
Yeah.
There is neither Jew nor Gentile, neither slave nor free, nor is there male and female, for you are all one in Christ Jesus. That's St. Paul's letter to the Galatians. It's a pretty good passage to finish with.